You know what's strange? The moment that changed the entire global economy didn't look dramatic at all. No explosions, no declaration of war, just a quiet decision in Washington in the summer of 1971. Richard Nixon stood in front of a camera and announced that the United States was closing the gold window. And most people watching had no idea they had just witnessed the beginning of something that would reshape the world for the next 50 years and beyond. So, what did that actually mean? Before 1971, every dollar in circulation was theoretically backed by gold. There was a hard limit on how much money America could create. If you held dollars, you could, in theory, exchange them for gold at a fixed rate. It was a constraint, a ceiling, and Nixon removed it. From that moment forward, the United States could create money without a physical anchor. No gold required, just political will and a printing press. And at first, honestly, it looked like a genius move. America could spend, it could build, it could project military power across the globe without immediately worrying about running out of resources. The deficits piled up, year after year. And yet, the system kept functioning. The dollar kept circulating. The world kept accepting it. But here's what most people don't ask. Why did the world keep accepting it? That's the real question. And the answer takes us to the desert. In the 1970s, Washington struck a deal with Saudi Arabia. A fairly simple arrangement on the surface. Oil will be priced in dollars, every barrel, everywhere, denominated in American currency. In exchange, the United States will provide military protection to the kingdom, security for currency dominance. It sounds almost too neat, but it worked. And what it created was something called the petrodollar system. Think about what that means in practice. If you're Japan and you need to import oil, you need dollars first. If you're Germany, same story. If you're Brazil, Indonesia, South Korea, it doesn't matter. You need energy, you need dollars. So suddenly, every government on earth has a structural reason to hold American currency. And the easiest, most reliable way to hold large quantities of dollars is to buy US Treasury bonds, which means foreign governments started financing American debt. Not because they were being charitable, because the system required it. So you have this extraordinary loop. America spends more than it earns, it issues debt, the world buys that debt because the world needs dollars, and because the world needs dollars, America can keep spending. The loop feeds itself, decade after decade. Now fast forward to today. The United States is carrying more than $34 trillion in federal debt. That number is almost impossible to visualize. If you spent $1 million every single day, it would take you nearly 100,000 years to spend $1 trillion. Multiply that by 34. The scale is genuinely hard to process. But here's the thing. The size of the debt isn't actually the most interesting part of this story. What's more interesting is the system that makes it possible, and what's happening to that system right now. Because something has shifted. Over the last 2 decades, countries like China and Russia started looking at the dollar system differently. Not as a neutral infrastructure, but as an American weapon. And they weren't entirely wrong to see it that way. Washington has used access to the dollar system as a geopolitical tool. Sanctions, freezing assets, cutting countries off from international banking networks. The message to any government that stepped out of line was pretty clear. Your economy runs on our currency, which means we have leverage over you. For a long time, most countries just accepted this reality. There wasn't really an alternative. But then something changed the calculation dramatically. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, and the Western response included freezing roughly $300 billion in Russian reserves held in Western financial institutions. From America's perspective, this was a powerful move, economic warfare. But from the perspective of countries in the global south, the ones watching from a distance, it sent a very different message. If it can happen to Russia, it can happen to anyone. Your savings, your reserves, your national wealth, sitting in Western banks, all of it is potentially one diplomatic crisis away from being inaccessible. That realization quietly accelerated something that had already been building. Countries started diversifying their reserves, more gold purchases, more trade settled in local currencies, more financial infrastructure built outside the American system. None of it looked dramatic in isolation, but the direction was clear. And this is where economics and geopolitics start colliding in ways that should make everyone nervous. Here's the logic, and it's worth following carefully. The United States doesn't just run a large economy. It runs a global security network. hundreds of military bases spread across dozens of countries, alliances that stretch from Europe to Asia to the Pacific, defense spending that exceeds the next several major powers combined. All of that costs money, enormous amounts of money. And all of that money ultimately depends on the ability to borrow cheaply and indefinitely. That ability depends on global demand for US Treasury bonds, which depends on global demand for dollars, which depends on the petrodollar system and the broader architecture of dollar dominance. So if dollar dominance weakens, the cost of maintaining all of that military infrastructure goes up. Interest payments on the debt rise. The federal government faces brutal choices. Cut the military, cut social programs, raise taxes in ways that are politically impossible, or just print more money and hope the system holds. None of those options are comfortable. And here's where the historical pattern becomes genuinely alarming. When dominant powers face this kind of financial pressure, they rarely respond by gracefully stepping back and accepting a smaller role in the world. That's not how power works. Instead, they tend to fight to preserve the system that sustains them, sometimes through economic pressure, sometimes through diplomatic maneuvering, and sometimes, historically, through military force. This doesn't mean there's some room full of American officials plotting wars to escape debt. It's not that simple or that conscious. The relationship is more structural. Debt creates pressures. Pressures shape the choices available to policymakers. And those constrained choices can push international relations in dangerous directions, even when nobody is explicitly choosing conflict. Think of it like tectonic plates. The stress builds invisibly for years, decades sometimes, and then something gives. A crisis erupts. It looks sudden from the outside, but the pressure was accumulating the whole time. Now, look at the current strategic environment through that lens. China is rising as both an economic and technological power. It's building alternative financial infrastructure, alternative trade routes, alternative institutions, the Belt and Road Initiative, the development of a digital yuan, the push for trade settled outside the dollar. These aren't just economic projects. They're challenges to the architecture of American financial dominance. Russia is pressing against Western security structures in ways that have already produced the largest conventional war in Europe since the Second World War. And across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, regional powers are pursuing increasingly independent foreign policies. Saudi Arabia, the very country whose oil deal created the petrodollar system, is now exploring selling oil in currencies other than the dollar. And simultaneously, the United States is running some of the largest peacetime deficits in its history. These trends aren't happening in separate boxes. They interact. Economic competition between the United States and China generates political tension. That political tension makes economic cooperation harder. Harder cooperation makes financial decoupling more likely. Financial decoupling weakens dollar demand. Weakening dollar demand increases debt pressure on America. And increased debt pressure reduces the flexibility available to American policymakers, making them more likely to respond aggressively to perceived threats. The cycle reinforces itself. Some people argue this doesn't matter, that because the United States controls its own currency, it can always technically service its debt, just print more dollars. And there's a kernel of truth there. A country that borrows in its own currency can't be forced into default the way Greece was during the European debt crisis. But that argument misses the real risk. The question isn't whether America can print dollars. The question is whether the world continues treating those dollars as valuable. And the answer to that question depends entirely on trust. Trust in the stability of American institutions. Trust in the rule of law that governs the dollar system. Trust that the financial architecture won't be weaponized against you. That trust, once eroded, is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. And trust is clearly eroding. Not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently in the decisions of central banks and governments around the world, you can see the hedging happening, the quiet diversification, the slow construction of alternatives. Here's the uncomfortable conclusion that all of this points toward. The system that allowed the United States to project power without immediate financial limits for 50 years may have built structural pressures into the international system that are now very difficult to release peacefully. A multipolar world is emerging, whether Washington wants it or not. China, Russia, India, and others are not going to simply accept indefinite American financial dominance. The question isn't whether the transition happens, it's how. And transitions of this scale in world history have very rarely been smooth. The optimistic scenario is gradual adaptation. The dollar remains important, but shares space with other currencies. American power remains significant, but is balanced by other major powers. International institutions evolve to reflect the new reality. Trade and finance become less concentrated and therefore less weaponizable by any single government. But that scenario requires something that is genuinely scarce right now. It requires political leadership in multiple countries willing to prioritize long-term stability over short-term advantage. It requires a willingness in Washington to accept a reduced but still significant global role. And it requires enough trust between competing powers to manage the transition without major conflict. Given the current state of US-China relations, given the war in Ukraine, given the fracturing of multilateral institutions, that optimistic scenario feels uncomfortably distant. The pessimistic scenario is that the pressures continue building, that financial stress in the United States generates more aggressive foreign policy, that rivals interpret that aggression as confirmation that the existing order needs to be dismantled faster, that miscalculations multiply, that what begins as economic competition slides into something far more dangerous. History is full of examples of this dynamic. Powers in decline and powers on the rise have collided before. Sometimes they found equilibrium. Often, they didn't. So the next time you see a headline about US debt levels, or sanctions against some country, or military deployments to some distant region, or trade disputes with China, try holding all of those things together in the same frame. Because they're not separate stories. They're different angles on the same story. A story about a financial system built on trust that is slowly running out of it, and a world that hasn't yet figured out what comes next. The line between an economic problem and a geopolitical crisis, it turns out, is thinner than most people realize. And in a world built on debt, that should concern all of us.